A very good afternoon to one and all. I, Sachin Rajgopalan, welcome you all on behalf of Shikshan Prasarak Mandali's Ramnarayan Roya Autonomous College, Department of Microbiology. Today we all are here for a dual lecture program on COVID-19. Today is the day one of the webinar, and we have Ms. Urmi Palan as our speaker with us. I would now request our Honorable Principal and Head of the Department of Microbiology, Dr. Anushri Lokur, to introduce our speaker for the day. Thank you, ma'am.
Now, I'm not going to talk much. We have waiting to listen to Urmi ma'am. And today's speaker, Dr. Palan, she does not need any introduction. She is one of us. I think many of you will know her also. She has been with us as a faculty of Department of Microbiology for last 36 years. And she has been a vice principal also, and she has done many other hats while in college. So let's not get into that. I think all of you know her as one of the authors of Palan and Pathak book. So she is the Palan from that Palan and Pathak book that many of you must be referring to. So without much introduction, currently she is working as a consultant microbiologist, National Burn Center, but we still don't believe that she is anyone who's outsider. She is one amongst us, and we are presenting her to you. So I request Urmi to start the lecture without much introduction further. Let us start. So all of us are waiting to hear from you, Urmi. And this is a very good topic, very much that it's your area of interest. And all of us want to know what is happening in this area of COVID, in the diagnosis sector of COVID-19. So thank you and welcome once again.
Thank you, Anushri. Formally, I think I should say thank you, Principal Dr. Anushri Lokur.
But, no need.
I still think that I'm a part of y'all, and it just feels that, though virtually, I'm so happy to be back amongst Ruya faculty and students that it does not feel as if I have ever been away. And I appreciate that you've selected what I normally have been liking. You know what is my area of interest, and in spite of being away all these days, that all of us have been away from everything, I've been continuously updating myself on the issue of COVID-19. And today, let me just say a good afternoon to all the participants who are here. And I really appreciate the fact that I'm in the midst of all my earlier colleagues and students. And we are going to look at one tiny aspect of the infection that we know as COVID-19. Now, I'm going to take you through this infection in brief, because we need to understand, or we have to focus basically on how to diagnose this infection that we call as COVID-19. Before we get into the nitty-gritties, as students of biological science, there are two things that I would appreciate if all of you would understand. One is that COVID-19 is extremely new. People were calling it the novel coronavirus for a long time before it got the name of SARS-CoV-2. Now, this SARS-CoV-2 virus that we are talking about is a novel virus. There's lots that we know because of the burst in technology, but there's lots that will still keep coming inside. So while we are talking today also, there's something happening somewhere, and by tonight again there will be certain updates which will say that there's something more that we can do, or there's something other than what we are already doing, or maybe we have to improve on what we are already doing. So let us keep this in mind, that there's going to be a constant update and a constant change in what is happening. And a personal request to all of you, as everyone who has some level of biological science at whatever level of your education that you are, let us not call this a corona disease. Corona is a family of viruses, of which SARS-CoV-2 is just one member. And COVID-19 is the infection caused by SARS-CoV-2. So when we talk of this, we are now going to talk of it either as COVID-19 infection or infection caused by SARS-CoV-2. I would really appreciate if this is taken as a personal message by all of you. Right? Now we get on to the nitty-gritties of what we need to talk about. And when we are getting into this, we need to go through a little bit of our understanding. And this our understanding that we want to talk about let me just open the
Screen.
presentation for you.
Requesting all participants to pin Urmi ma'am's screen. You can see there are two names as Urmi Palan. So you will see Urmi Palan presenting. So you can pin that screen now to see her presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so while we are going to go through this series of slides that I have made in front of you, there's going to be a lot more that we need to know, and at regular intervals maybe a brief input on that is what I might be giving you, because that's going to help you to appreciate what we are talking of when we talk of diagnosis. Right now, what is diagnosis? We already know now what is COVID-19, but what do you mean by the term diagnosis? If you want to diagnose something, we want to establish a cause of a problem. And when that problem happens to be an illness, as in the case of COVID-19, we need to establish what is the cause of that particular infection or what is the cause of that particular illness. Since it is an infection, we need to know what is the causative agent of this infection. And this, in technical terms, then we will call as finding out the etiological agent. But that etiological agent finding out has a different reason. Whereas when we are talking of diagnosis, very often we want to diagnose an infection or an illness because we want to know how to handle the patient and how to go about treating that infection. So we are going to look at it from both the points of view. Now, to understand, or as I said, to appreciate what we are going to say a little later, let us just quickly go through what SARS-CoV-2 does when it enters into our system. It is predominantly a respiratory infection, was first thought to cause an acute respiratory distress syndrome, which means that all the symptoms were acute, sudden onset, and they were all related to the respiratory tract. This led us to understand that the infection is a respiratory tract infection. Its portal of entry, therefore, is going to be the upper respiratory tract. Moves downwards, reaches the lungs. While it is moving downwards, this infection causes a very high level of inflammation. Inflammation is normally a defense mechanism, a part of the innate immune mechanism that our body has, and we'll always have inflammation irrespective of what the causative agent is. So having inflammation is not a characteristic of a SARS-CoV-2 infection. But in the case of SARS-CoV-2, what has been found is that the level of inflammation is extremely high. This level of inflammation is so high that the cytokines which would be secreted during the process of inflammation are being secreted in very large amounts quantitatively, which leads to what we now term as a cytokine storm. And this cytokine storm, therefore, is also thought to be one of the reasons of causing a variety of symptoms in the patients. Most importantly, what it is doing is it is damaging the alveoli. Now, alveoli, as we know, is responsible for the exchange of gases that happens in the lungs, as we have studied maybe sometime in high school. So when we come to diagnosis, we will appreciate why that amount of gases or amount of oxygen or whatever is going to be important to help us in the diagnosis. Another fact that happens is that the neutrophil levels go very high. Now, neutrophil levels normally go high whenever there is a pathogen, But extreme high levels are an indication that there's going to be a very high amount of phagocytosis. And a very high amount of phagocytosis is also responsible for the high level of cytokines that are present over there, and it will also change the concentrations or the cocktail of cytokines that are going to be present. This again is something that we might be able to use when we want to diagnose the infection. There are reports which say that the infection does not get restricted to the lungs. Infection moves, infection goes to the kidneys, infection goes to the gastrointestinal tract. Infection is known to cause cardiac disorders also. As a consequence, very often one might have to look at these other stages apart from having a milder respiratory situation. So these are facts that we need to keep in mind before we think of how to move ahead with the diagnosis. Now, when we say diagnosis, there can be various kinds. Our aim, when we, as I said earlier, and I'm repeating now, our aim is to find out what is responsible for the illness and to confirm that this illness is caused by a particular pathogen. Now, this can be done by various mechanisms depending on the kind of illness. We have broadly classified diagnosis as clinical diagnosis and laboratory diagnosis. Clinical diagnosis is what the doctor or the clinician does when the patient presents himself or herself to the doctor. This is essentially going to be therefore dependent on what is the medical history of the patient, what are the signs and symptoms, and whatever else the doctor might want to may feel relevant about the patient on observing them. Right? So this is essentially, a clinical diagnosis is essentially based on what the patient or how the patient presents to the doctor and whatever are the signs of being not normal or what we term as a diseased state. On the other hand, a laboratory diagnosis is diagnosis which is carried out with the help of various kinds of tests that can be done in the laboratories. These tests can be varied. There are different types. They could be microbiological, they could be biochemical tests, they could be imaging techniques. There could be a whole variety of things that one might want to look at. What needs to be done in a particular infection, again, will depend on what is happening in the body. So as we looked at the infection, we look at the pathogenesis, we look at what are the changes that the pathogen is causing in the patient. And these changes that the pathogen is causing in the patient is what is going to guide us in terms of how to do the lab diagnosis. The most crucial amongst them being what is the portal of entry and exit. Now, as soon as we know what is the portal of entry, we know what samples to collect. And once we know the portal of exit, we know how the infection is going to spread. A good diagnostic test should have a very high efficiency of recovery. When we say efficiency of recovery, we don't mean recovery of the patient, we mean recovery of the agent which is causing the infection. So a very good diagnostic test would be one which will be able to give us a very good signal or a message as to what is causing the infection. And ideally, a good laboratory diagnostic technique would be if we could prove the Koch's postulates. I'm sure you're familiar with the Koch's postulates, and otherwise when we look at microbiological techniques, we will briefly touch upon this. Right? Now we look at what are clinical diagnostic tests and how will they help us to decide what is causing the infection. A clinical diagnostic test is used for us to evaluate a patient's medical condition. It needs obviously an understanding of the pathogenesis. It's going to be able to tell us what could be possibly there, may not always tell us a conclusive diagnosis. There can be some instances, especially when we talk of illnesses, where a clinical diagnostic test may be sufficient. But those are very few instances. Clinical diagnostic tests generally are going to be guidelines which are going to guide us towards what kind of tests to perform in order to come to a proper etiological diagnosis. Right? So clinical diagnostic tests have certain limitations and therefore cannot be the only method of diagnosing. So then we look at what are the lab diagnostic techniques. Now laboratory diagnostic techniques, as the name suggests, are techniques which are going to be performed in specialized laboratories. And specialized laboratories today have a very high level of specialization because we are dealing with infections in a time where technology has moved way ahead from what it was even a few years ago. So laboratory diagnostic techniques are highly specialized and therefore are always going to require highly specialized trained personnel or staff. And a lab diagnostic test is going to need a very clear understanding of the host pathogen interaction. Why is this necessary? A host pathogen interaction is necessary because a pathogen just cannot enter into our system, decide to stay there and cause disease. A pathogen is entering into the system as something, as an entity which needs to find a place for itself to survive. Now, our body has mechanisms by which it is not wanting to allow somebody which is an outsider to enter into the system. As a consequence, there is a very dynamic situation in the system at any given time where host system, which we call as the immune system, and the pathogen are at war. And it is the consequence of this war that is going to tell us what is going to be the outcome of this interaction. At any given stage, either of them the balance could be tilted in either of their favor. Unless and until we know how this interaction is happening, we will not know at what time, what diagnostic test to perform. Right? To give you a specific example with COVID, suppose I say that, oh, okay, I need to isolate the viral RNA, let us say. I will not be able to detect the RNA if I'm going to take a random swab. Or I might take a blood sample, or I might say that, okay, maybe it is affecting the kidney. So I need to understand how these are interacting. Is the pathogen becoming intracellular? If it is becoming intracellular, which specific part of the system is it affecting? What would be the right time? Does it move from a primary site to a secondary site? As a consequence, unless and until this entire path is well elucidated, we are not going to have a very efficient diagnostic test. So good understanding of the host pathogen interaction is just as important as having a good laboratory in order to know how to get the right tests done. And as we understand the host pathogen interaction, we will appreciate the fact that very often then we are going to have more than one parameter which needs to be evaluated in order to come to some kind of conclusive diagnosis. Right? So we look at what we have specifically for COVID-19. COVID-19, again, if you could recollect, we now know what kind of an infection it is, and predominant symptoms are going to be respiratory symptoms. Now, if we look at the list that you have in front of you on the screen, you will realize that none of these symptoms are specific only for COVID-19. And in fact, you look at fever, you look at cough, you look at a sore throat, all these are characteristics of a normal inflammation which would happen whenever there is any respiratory tract infection. So when the patient presents himself or herself to the doctor with this set of symptoms, maybe the extent of breathlessness could be an indication. But this extent of breathlessness, again, can be seen in patients with pneumonia. So does not again mean that it is going to be only because of COVID-19. As a consequence, a clinical diagnosis of COVID-19 is just an indicator which may say, okay, maybe a patient could be suffering from COVID-19 because the patient is suffering from a respiratory infection. In COVID-19, we have another small problem that we need to keep in mind when we are deciding what tests to do and what not to do, is that the incubation period, what we call as the time from time of infection to time of onset of symptoms, varies from 2 to 14 days. An accepted average today is about 5.5 days, which means that 5.5 days after a person comes in contact with the virus and the virus has entered into the system is going to be probably the time when symptoms are going to appear in most of the patients. In some patients, it may not. If it does not, and may say that, okay, now the doctor suggests that since it's, just about 5 days since there was a likely contact, let us look for COVID-19, and we may end up with a false negative. We may end up with a false negative because maybe the virus has already moved way down and taking a throat swab may not be enough. Or the virus is still up there and I may get a very good response. So these variations are going to be there, and as a consequence, deciding on the right test and relating it to the symptoms is going to be normally a little tricky. With the data that is coming inside, we've looked at another parameter, another test or another symptom, which one would not really call a symptom, but something which is happening in the body, is that because of the involvement of the lungs, the exchange of gases, as I told you, if you remember that there is an involvement of the alveoli and therefore exchange of gases is getting affected, saturation concentrations of oxygen in blood are decreasing in patients who have got COVID-19. So one of the parameters that is now being looked at, which clinicians are being able to do at their level before it goes to a laboratory test also very often, is to look at these oxygen concentrations. And keeping all this in mind, the doctor or the clinician decides on what would be the type of laboratory tests that need to be performed. Now, laboratory tests, as I told you earlier, are going to be tests which need to give us, or which ideally should be giving us, a very, very precise, specific answer. And the answer is to the question of what is causing COVID-19. Or answer is to the question, is the patient suffering from an infection caused by SARS-CoV-2? There are various strategies or approaches that one can have for carrying out lab diagnosis. Each of them has got its pros and cons. And because each of them has got its own advantages and disadvantages, we may sometimes have to perform more than one test to confirm the diagnosis. Right? So let us look at what are these approaches. Approach one is to be able to recover the virus from the patient and identify it as the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Right? Now this would prove Koch's postulates, because this infection, though is only 4 or 5 months old across the globe, with the way technology is moving and with the way there is an involvement of so many countries across the world, and with WHO guidelines and standards that have been put in place, today it is the norm as far as COVID-19 is concerned, is that no country is going to hide any information. So whoever has found something puts it on the public domain, and the other countries and other people can move ahead in finding out something else, which is going to all finally end of the day benefit the entire population, which is now affected very severely by COVID-19, right? So right in the initial days itself, this virus has been isolated. This virus has been identified. The structure is very well known. If all of you look at the paper today, you will be seeing a whole lot of pictures. Every day there is a picture of SARS-CoV-2 in every newspaper. Right? So an ideal approach then would be that the doctor advises that the patient should give a sample, and the sample is processed in a laboratory and the virus isolated and identified. difficult, and in most cases, in most laboratories, in quite a few countries, not possible. Various reasons for this. It needs very high level of expertise. It needs very specific kind of equipment, and it is going to be time consuming. As a consequence, considering the rate of infection of this, rate of spread of this infection, it's always going to be better if we could have any test that would be able to give us results faster and could be equally efficient, could be equally specific, could be equally precise. And therefore, one looked at the next best thing to do, and the next best thing to do is to look for the viral nucleic acid. In this case, as we already know, it is the corona family, and therefore it is an RNA virus. So you look for the viral RNA. Again, the entire genome has been characterized. This has been shared by everybody. People know what are the important sites. People know what are the sites that are mutating and changing. And as a consequence, detecting this viral nucleic acid, we know what to look for. People knew what to look for. People understood what to look for. People tried and developed. We had the whole world as a whole had the advantage of having handled another epidemic earlier, which was HIV, which was also an RNA virus. So RT-PCRs were in place. Now what we've done is that we have, most countries in the world have developed tests which are based on this RT-PCR technique. And this RT-PCR technique now, therefore, is the gold standard for diagnosing infection caused by SARS-CoV-2, or what we call as the COVID-19 infection. First approach, the standard approach, the most important approach is to be able to show that the person carries the particular virus, which we are doing with the help of the RT-PCR. Now, if RT-PCR is this, why should we not do only RT-PCR, and why would one want to look for something else? There are two reasons for this. One, RT-PCR is an expensive technique. Not too many countries have been able to develop it for themselves. Second, RT-PCR takes some time before it can give you results. Results are not going to appear in a few minutes. Results are not going to appear maybe in an hour or two, and would require a longer time. What we call as the time of return for the test. Meaning, once you do the test, once you get the sample, how long does it take before you can send out the report? This time of return is a bit long, and understanding that this infection has a very high infectivity, which means that it's spreading at a very rapid rate, RT-PCR may not be possible to be done on all patients. One therefore has to have alternatives, but as I said earlier, I'm repeating now, RT-PCR is today the gold standard for diagnosing this infection. Understanding those limitations, people obviously looked at other approaches. The first disadvantage that we mentioned there was the time that is coming back. So we wanted to look at a test which was faster. And this faster test is considered to be equally sensitive, or considered to be equally specific, and that is the rapid antibody test. This rapid antibody test that we are talking about is to detect the presence of antibodies in a person who is suspected to be carrying the virus and therefore is infected by it. The rapid is only because it gives the results fast. Here we need a little bit of understanding of, again, how he is responding, what types of antibodies are being produced. We know that now it does produce IgM and IgG. So there is some query as to, since it is there in the mucosal linings, is it possible that there could be IgA? But these are not going to be, IgA is not going to be easily seen in the serum, and therefore is not being used for a diagnostic test. Now, what are the limitations of this antibody test? Antibody test has the advantage of it that it's coming out fast. Antibody test is specific because every antibody is specific for a particular antigen which is being carried by SARS-CoV-2, right? Disadvantage here is that it gives or can give false negative results. These false negative results are because since it is a viral infection, detecting small levels of antibody is difficult. Antibodies are a response to the presence of the pathogen, which is going to be carrying the antigen or the epitope. And as a consequence, there is a time lag before the response can be seen. Because of this time lag, very often, if we take the blood sample earlier, we may not detect antibodies in sufficient levels to be able to say that they are present, and we would therefore say that the person is not carrying antibodies, and would we then therefore say that the person is therefore not infected by SARS-CoV-2. This is what we mean by the false negative results due to the lower sensitivity and the late onset of the detectable antibodies that are present in serum. So though it is fast, though it is specific, this becomes one of its major disadvantage. Because of the delayed onset, this delayed onset for IgG, which is in high amounts and therefore can be detected a lot more easily than IgM, is that it comes only after 7 days normally. May take from 7 to 10 days to get detectable levels, and this 7 to 10 days is enough for the virus to assert itself and already cause the symptoms in high severity if it is going to be a severe infection in that individual. Therefore, using this as a diagnostic test, there are lots of limitations, and therefore people are wary of doing this very routinely. Okay? So we have another approach. So the next approach that one is looking at is that we need to look at molecules which could be generated by the virus, or molecules which could be present because of the disease which is caused because of the virus. So here again, if we go back to what we discussed earlier, we have a lot of inflammatory molecules being released. So one can try to look at these levels. One can try to look at oxygen concentrations. And while we are talking of oxygen concentrations, there's something very interesting that is known about the COVID-19 infection, is that normally when oxygen concentration reduces in the blood, the person tends to become delirious, which does not happen in the case of people because suffering from COVID-19, maybe because this oxygen concentration lowering is purely because of the alveolar effect, and it's not because there is a reduced uptake in the other parts of the body. And therefore, initially a low oxygen concentration level and the person not being delirious is going to be probably an indication that this infection is caused by COVID-19 and it is not some other infection which also causes a lower level of oxygen. Along with that, we now know what kind of damage is happening to the lungs. What is seen, or what the damage that is caused is termed as a opaque glass kind of picture. That means the patches that one sees on the X-ray gives the high level of opacity. And this high level of opacity is an indication of the high damage to the alveoli in that region, which may get restricted first to the lowest part of the lung and then goes moving towards the rest of the lungs, and could lead to an entire respiratory distress in the patient if more amount of lungs are getting affected. So taking repeated X-rays, looking at oxygen levels, looking at other parameters would be an early indication that the patient is suffering from COVID-19, and one looks at starting to give palliative care or hospitalization depending on the severity of these parameters by the time the RT-PCR results get back to a person. So a normal approach then is to look at all these put together, right? So what should be done theoretically? If I were to write, if you know, in a few maybe some books that are going to come out a little later, we will have COVID-19 as one of the infections that one has studied as emerging infections. And if you look at a list of lab diagnoses, you will have lab diagnosis as the clinical picture, the X-ray picture, the blood parameters, the amount of neutrophils that are present, amount of inflammatory that are present, amount of oxygen that are present, and the RT-PCR, all these put together. Okay, this would ideally what would have to be done. Now we come to the scenario as it is today, because I think that is a lot more relevant for you to understand, or for all of us rather to understand, as to what are we doing now as a community, what are we doing globally, and how are we going to deal with this pandemic that is there in front of us, and what kind of tests should we do to know whether a person is suffering from COVID-19. This requires a lot of strategy. This requires a lot of input from various levels, from health authorities, from government. And when they make those strategies, what they will have to keep in mind are two very important things about this virus. One is its infectivity, which is very high, and the second, its mortality, which is much lower than most other coronaviruses. So though we know that the cases are very high, we also know that the number of people who are getting infected is very high. A smaller percentage is showing the symptoms, and even smaller percentage has symptoms which would even suggest hospitalization, and an even smaller percentage which is going to show mortality, right? So high infectivity and low mortality are the two main criteria based on which we are going to decide, and we are going to say what we are doing now currently, right? So these are the three things that we are keeping in mind, and based on these three things, what is the strategy that is being followed today? Today, what we are doing is that all flu-like symptoms have to be reported to a clinic. As per government guidelines, these are termed as fever clinics. In these fever clinics, the clinician will look at the fever, the extent of cough, the type of cough that is there. They have, simple equipment where in less than a minute, what are the oxygen concentrations or oxygen levels that are present. They can understand what is the extent of breathlessness that the person is suffering from. And if any of these above are positive, then the person is referred to a lab which is going to do the RT-PCR. While the person's test reports get back, because as we've already said, that what we are doing is a test which is the gold standard, which is going to give us the correct results, but is going to take time. And since the infectivity is high, we don't want this to spread. So all those who are in the high risk area or who have been close contacts will be kept separately, and this person does not go back home and goes to a center where test results have to wait till the test results come back. During that time, if symptoms worsen, obviously the person moves to the next level of healthcare that is there, or the person waits in that quarantine center. Rest of the contacts are normally kept in home quarantine and their tests done, though they may not have symptoms, because as we already said, there are a lot of asymptomatic cases and they could be the ones who would be able to spread it. Simultaneously, what we have to do and what is being done is that the source of the infection, so a proper medical history, who would they come in contact with, from where would be a probable infection having come, is traced. And to ensure that this is not a random spread, which we call as a community spread, but it is going to be traced to coming from a particular person, right? So this is what we are doing today. This is how we are progressing, and this is what is telling us that finally the gold standard the test that we need to perform is always going to be the RT-PCR, and all other tests that we have spoken of are going to help us to confirm that this is going to be a case which requires specific care in terms of quarantine or hospitalization till the RT-PCR results come back to us. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was indeed a very wonderful talk. Now, I would request Ms. Shweta Tiwari from Department of Microbiology to moderate the question and answer section. We also request the students to post their questions in the chat section. Over to you, Shweta.
Hello, ma'am. There are a few questions that have been posted by students and faculty members. One of them is that they want you to throw some light on asymptomatic SARS-CoV infections.
An asymptomatic SARS-CoV infection, as the name suggests, would say that there are no obvious symptoms in the patient. But there is a chance that the person may have come in contact with the people who are probably carrying the infection, or there is a chance that they are handling patients who have got. So a large proportion of these could also be close contacts of people who are already positive and the healthcare workers who are constantly working with the patients, or constantly dealing with the patients in the hospitals.
The other thing that students want to know is about the failure of plasma therapy, because currently there are a lot of trials that are being done on use of plasma therapy, but it is failing. So they want to know what is the reason which has led to the failure of the plasma therapy.
Okay, first let us be a little more clear in what we are calling as therapy, as plasma therapy failure is. I may not at this point want to call it a failure because we don't have enough data. But yes, it is. I will not call it a success. And why will we not call it a success is because when you require, by the time you are giving plasma therapy requires is essentially trying to give pure antibodies. Now, pure antibodies against COVID-19 at this point are going to be coming in only from people who have already suffered from the infection. Only then, unless and until they have an active infection, have had an active infection, they are not going to have very high titers. Second, it's a protein. It's a protein coming from another person coming into our system. It's going to persist for a short while. We don't know still at how much of IgM and how much of IgG does that person still carry. And therefore, we will need a lot of plasma to give therapy to a few individuals. And therefore, when it is in the trial stage, obviously, it has been given to people who are already very serious. As a consequence, chances of something acting, when the damage has already been done to the body, though you are giving an antibody which could neutralize potentially the virus which is going to come out of the damaged cell, you are not going to be able to undo the damage to the cells which have already got affected. So the lung picture may be very poor. Patients may have moved on to having a kidney involvement, a cardiac involvement, and as a consequence, those damages which are already done cannot be undone by giving antibodies. And so a plasma therapy is something which can be given to a person to tide over a phase before the person's own system takes charge and recovers. Plasma therapy is not killing of virus before it causes the damage. Right? So it has a different logic, and it will need a lot more tests, lot more validation before we can say whether it can be done or whether it cannot be done.
I'm combining two questions over here. People are also interested in knowing whether is there a possibility of a relapse or getting infected again once when you have been treated for COVID.
Okay, now again here, let me put forward to you what I said right in the beginning, is that it's a new virus. It's a novel coronavirus, right? And we really don't have data. People are showing presence of virus even after recovery, which means that maybe the virus is persisting, and maybe it will show some infection at a later point, maybe show some symptoms at a later point, not infection, because the person is already infected, right? There may be a chance that the virus remains latent in the system and asserts itself at a later point. There may be a chance that the virus may get slightly modified, as happens in the case of influenza virus, and therefore your own antibodies may now not be enough to take care, and something, few symptoms may come up again. All this is just hypothesis. We cannot at this point, nobody will be able to say whether there is a likelihood of relapse or whether there is no likelihood of relapse.
So, ma'am, is this the also reason because of which we initially see that there are some patients who report negative, but then later on report positive after some days?
No, it depends. See, normally, whenever you're talking of any test, it's going to depend on the load of that particular pathogen being present, the amount in which it is present. Now, if the infection happens with a low viral number, then by the time I get sufficient virus to show the symptoms and I get sufficient virus to be able to extract it out and get it, it may take time. And therefore, I may get a low number. It may happen that my immune system is taking care, and this is what is happening in most of the cases, that the immune system is taking care of it as it is. And if the immune system is taking care of it, active viral particles which are going to infect and which I'm going to be able to take and extract out the RNA and do an RT-PCR is going to reduce. That also is a reason why you may have a low number.
The participants also want you to have some more information about the reason of or what happens when COVID-19 infects a cancer patient. That is one question that has been raised over here. And other than that, people also want to know about cytokine burst.
Okay. Now, when you look at cancer, or for that matter, let me add on something similar we could talk of if you must have all heard of comorbidities. That a person who has got comorbidities is going to suffer more or is more likely to get infection. Now, here we have to get, from the data that is available, it does not show concretely that a person who's got cancer or a person who has got any other comorbidity has a greater chance of infection. What it says is that there is a greater severity of infection. That means that person is going to suffer more than another individual who does not have comorbidity. Incidence of infection might still remain the same. Okay. And this therefore tries to explain, tell us the reason is that whether we are talking of cancer, whether we are talking of any other comorbidities, in most of the times the immune system has got compromised. Once the immune system has got compromised, your immune system, which is taking care, and like I said, that 80 to 85% of the people are not going to suffer, are not going to need hospitalization when they have got COVID-19. This is because their immune system is taking care of the virus while the virus is trying to assert itself. So you may have low-grade symptoms, or you may not have any symptoms at all, but you are definitely not going to have the level of symptoms where you're going to need hospitalization. Someone might have to give you oxygen, or someone might have to put you on a ventilator. These things are not going to happen in 80 to 85% of the cases as per the data that we have till now, right? So the person with cancer or person with comorbidity has an immune compromised status, and therefore falls in that remaining 15 to 20% of the patients which are likely to be able to, where the symptoms are going to be more severe. And once symptoms are more severe, then obviously their system is not normal. They have got conditions where maybe their heart is as it is weak, and therefore the chances of getting a cardiac arrest may be higher. They have a system where they are on kinds of therapies for other disorders which are suppressing the immune system, and as a consequence their body is not going to be able to take care of it, and severity of infection and maybe chance of mortality is going to be higher.
Ma'am, rapid test tells us
Hmm.
about the presence of antibodies, but then it doesn't say whether the infection is active or no. So is it still significant in diagnosis?
It is, that is exactly what I said. So it is not really significant in diagnosis. Okay, but there is another concept in uh, infections, and especially when you're talking of epidemics and pandemics, is that there's something known as herd immunity. So by knowing how many people have got antibodies in the system, I will be able to know how many people have already encountered the virus, and therefore how safe is it for them to be able, even if they come in contact with a virus at a later, or a challenge dose at a later date, maybe because of infection or maybe because of carrying out a test, right? So, and rapid antibody tests, though not called as a diagnostic test, because if I can look at a rising titer, I can look at IgG today and I can look at IgG after 2 days, and if the titer is increasing, that means it is an active infection. I have very high titer, also indicates an active infection. But the problem is that these tests are coming positive only after quite a few days. By that time, all the other symptoms are already in place. We've already performed the RT-PCR. So a rapid antibody test is not a replacement for RT-PCR. A rapid antibody test, therefore, even now, is not being performed on patients to know whether they are suffering from it or not. It has moved to an area where they are trying to study what are the antibody levels in communities, in populations, in people who are healthcare workers, to know that maybe they have already come in contact and therefore they have got some titer.
So, ma'am, if we are using RT-PCR, we are targeting the target region of the virus. Since we
Yes.
already know that the virus is prone to mutations, will this affect the diagnostic method in any case?
No, it should not affect the diagnostic method if it is a good diagnostic method, if it's a good RT-PCR that is being done, because the primer selections are done based on sequences which are going to remain and sequences which are getting mutated. And till now, fortunately, the data that we have with this, all the tests for RT-PCR, or all the other, let me put it differently, the mutations that are happening on the genome of the virus are not happening on segments which are, one, affecting the immunity, and two, affecting the primers that are being used.
Ma'am, is the deficiency of vitamin B12 and temperature related to elevated viral titers in patients?
Again, here, these are theories, these are hypotheses, and all these are there in front of us because we know that in spite of high infectivity, we have low morbidity, which means active cases are lower. If active or symptomatic cases are lower, it means that the system is taking care. And if the system has to take care, it needs that its quota of vitamin D, and it needs its quota of vitamin K, and it needs its quota of vitamin B12, because all these are there to take care of all the other molecules that your body is going to generate to fight the virus. Right? So
Yes.
all these are in place today, or are being touted of as maybe you can use it prophylactically. Some people are saying that, okay, let us take a daily dose of vitamin D so that we are not going to come down with the infection. It doesn't happen that way. What it does is that unless and until you have a deficiency, you don't bother. If you have a deficiency, then yes, because unless you have enough vitamin D, a lot of your calcium and other positive ion movement is going to get affected, and this is going to affect the normal functioning of your system, which helps in taking care of the infection. And this is true to a greater extent to most of the vitamins that we talk of.
So, ma'am, in this case, we have already learned that having a good immunity will be a good way to cope up with the infection.
Yes,
But it has been
true.
also reported that
Hmm.
in infants which are very young, like for example, let's say 2 to 3 months, they
Hmm.
generally have a weaker immune system as compared to other people, but then still they are
Hmm.
recovering nicely. So, what could be the reason for this?
One of the reasons, again, a hypothesis which has been put forward, where people studied a whole lot of kids who had got infection. One is is that we should note that the number of kids getting the infection itself is lower. So the probability here is that the target cells and the target receptors which the virus is going to require to enter into the cell, host cell, and cause damage are probably in lower numbers. Because when we say that the immune system is not fully developed, we know that a whole lot of parameters and a whole lot of receptors on many of our innate cells and many of the molecules of the innate system are also not being produced at the right level. Your body does not have the capacity to generate those molecules. And therefore, that cytokine storm that we were talking of also is probably not occurring in children.
Ma'am, people also wanted to know that since we are talking about detection, it is basically antibody detected that we are generally using. So can we go for antigen-based detection test in case of COVID?
Antigen-based detection test means looking at the viral proteins.
Viral proteins, correct, ma'am.
Correct. Now, viral proteins, as we understand any viral infection, is that they are going to stay on the outside and the genome is what is going inside finally and causing the taking over the machinery of the cell. Outside, as in, it is going to remain associated with the external of the cell in a particular tissue or in a particular organ.
Yes.
Now, every time you have some protein which is there in this manner, your own proteolytic enzymes are very likely to break them. For one thing.
Correct.
And because they are viral surface proteins, they are normally not very large.
Correct.
So their activity as an antigen is very restricted and they get broken down by enzymes a lot more easily. So their detection in the right form is going to become that much difficult.
Okay, ma'am. People also want you to share some light about the vaccines that are available, about the drug that is remdesivir, which is generally being used, and about viral interference strategy. So these are the base. I would just sum it up that they are more interested in the medicines that can be used and the vaccines that will be coming up.
I think we will probably need another session if I have to tell you about all the medicines and vaccines that need to be used. And I would personally feel that we should not get into that at the moment. But not that I don't want to tell you is that most of it, from whatever talks that I've been having with people at various parts of the world who are, in the front line handling the patients, they are very clear with one statement, and that is there is no treatment. Whatever is being used because it is supposed to have some effect. It has worked somewhere else or is likely to work over here. And everybody is, it's like, and this is, if I quote from the person who told me this, it's saying like, "Bhubne wale ko tinke ka sahara." Since people are scared, they would want to do something, and you try out whatever is possible. Again, this trying out happens in patients who are in hospital who are serious, because they have, most of these are going to have a whole lot of side effects. So as a consequence, everything is just at the trial. There's nothing which, as soon as there is a treatment, as soon as there's a treatment, people will be free to move out. The reason that we are not free to move out today is purely because of the high infectivity and no treatment. So, let us accept that. And there are a whole lot of candidates for treatment. There are a whole lot of candidates for vaccines. And maybe some other time, you all will get information.
Can I add, Shweta?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I would like to tell all the participants that we are going to have a series on COVID where we will be covering all these other aspects that you are talking about. In this 1 hour, one lecture, when we are concentrating only on diagnostics, we can't cover everything. So we will be having sessions on vaccines, treatment, everything. So all your questions will be answered slowly, right?
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
So, that's it from the questions session. I will hand over the screen now to Sachin. Sachin.
Now I'll request Dr. Varsha Shukla to speak a few words. Varsha ma'am, over
Yes,
to you.
I am here to say thank you to all of you, all the participants who have joined this webinar. This was the first webinar that Department of Microbiology has held, and I know that a lot of you could not join because of some technical glitch. And we are trying to resolve this glitch, and we will definitely come out with a solution before tomorrow's webinar is going to be launched. And I thank Urmi for this wonderful talk. You know, I always say, once a teacher, always a teacher.
As a teacher.
So she has, and I, you know, in she has used this digital platform for the first time to deliver a lecture, but she has done it really very well because obviously she is an expert in the field that she talked about right now. And she has elucidated everything in very, very simple yet detailed manner. And I'm sure all of you also have got solutions to your doubts that you all have posted on the chat. So thank you, all of you. Thank you on behalf of the Department of Microbiology, because all of you all are Ruiyites. I'll not say on behalf of Ruia College, but I thank Urmi on behalf of Ruia College, although she is a part of our family. She is not on the roll now, so I thank her on behalf of Ramnaran and Ruia Autonomous College. Thanks a lot, Urmi, and see
Can
you
I-
all tomorrow. Yes, Urmi.
Can I say a few words? I would want to thank all the participants, and I hope that maybe I have made some sense in transmit and whatever I've tried to say, and I've transmitted whatever I thought I should be, telling all the students. I hope it has been a good this thing, and I personally thank the entire Department of Microbiology for giving me this opportunity. Like I told